This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
Did the Black church, on the whole in the Americas, did they basically have a better social political understanding of Scripture?
Yeah. I think it's a great point, and I would wholeheartedly agree with it that the Black church on the whole did and does have a better, social, political, ethical kind of theology than the dominant culture, and I think that we see that across the board in church history, that when the church is really kind of in league with or in serving the interests of power and empire, then it often doesn't really reflect the beloved community, the kingdom of Jesus that we see the early church reflecting, that really lived and breathed in the margins. But throughout church history, when we see powerful movements of revival and gospel witness, it's oftentimes in situations of marginality and subalternity or context of oppression. And so I think in the United States, you have as just one of many examples, you have this dominant church that is supporting the theft of land from indigenous people, that's supporting manifest destiny and genocide of indigenous peoples and the trafficking of African humans and the subjugation of African peoples that built this country and this hemisphere, really. And you almost have, again, really like kind of two, to use the Didache language, you have two ways almost. You have these kind of two different, almost seemingly opposing, kind of strands of theology. One, again, that is supporting this, these evil systems of oppression. And then on the other hand, you have this church movement that's actually happening in the context of the very people who are being oppressed. And so you have on one level, you have the same faith, it's Christianity. And yet at the same time, it feels like two completely different religions in a way, one that is supporting the, kind of systems of oppression, and then another church that is actually calling for the liberation of the very people who are being oppressed. And I think, Frederick Douglass said it best that, in his autobiography, that there's a sharp distinction between what, to use his language, the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity of this land. And he says to be the friend of one is to, of necessity, be the enemy of the other, and that you can't be down with both of them. And so I think that, but again, I think that church, that system of theology, the theology and the praxis that developed in the Negro spirituals and among the earliest Black Christians in the United States and and other parts of the diaspora is really a much closer reflection of the New Testament church that the apostles gave witness to than an expression or a kind of a version of Christianity that envisions, again, an oppressive empire and supports that. When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people know, oppressed so hard.
Okay, so you said a lot just right there. And so I want to go back and dig in a few places. So, the church in support of empire and the support of traditional levers of power. We can imagine all the stories that we know of Western civilization, of the West, where this has happened. I do also, you're an early church scholar, so you'll have to correct me on this if I've gotten it wrong. But, the Acts of Thomas, not the Gospel of Thomas, but the Acts of Thomas, he goes and serves the purposes of the king Gundafar there. So he goes immediately into the service of the empire. And I also think of Nubia, which I think you would correct me and say, or sorry, it wasn't Ethiopia, but it was actually Nubia that the gospel goes down to. It goes down into the court of Queen Candace. So it encounters empire everywhere it goes. How would you distinguish that from what you just described as the church in the service of the empire?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I'm so glad you asked that, because it helps us to, see how these dynamics played out even before the 17th or 16th century.
Right. We don't even have to get into the European problems yet. Yeah.
Yeah. And also it really helps us to humanize, all of us as a human race, because, again, as you mentioned, like, one thing that I encounter a lot in the early church, sometimes we have this kind of romanticized picture, and it's honestly, it's easy to have a romanticized picture of the dominant, let's say the dominant white church in America and the black church, like, right. I mean, in this space in the United States, for the most part, the dominant church has either been actively supporting acts of oppression or at best, oftentimes turning a blind eye, or just kind of focusing on spiritual salvation and not really actually questioning, maybe giving out food and doing charity, but not actually questioning how to destabilize and undo acts of systemic systems of oppression, right? And then on the other hand, you have the black church, which is just this powerful prophetic witness of gospel truth and biblical authority, and also of civil rights and systemic change. And it's almost just like, again, this night and day. So it's almost easy to kind of romanticize and think that European Christianity is just like completely oppressive, and that African descended Christianity is just this idealized perfect thing. But in actuality, we look at early church. There are actually examples of even I like to use kind of these kind of this term of Imperial Christendom, right? There's God's vision of the gospel and the kingdom that, again, lives and breathes in the margins. And in the black church context, we call that gospel hymenode, or a gospelist perspective. But then there's this Imperial Christendom. And again, it's something that I would say really goes back to the time of Constantine and the Roman church, where we're starting in the 300s. The church was able to, for the first time, envision a powerful church, that a church that actually can have social and civic power and can be determinative for not just religious, but all other aspects of society, that Christians can be dominant. That was never conceivable, in the earliest centuries of the church. Even you mentioned Thomas in the 200s. The Acts of Thomas is written in the 200s, and it tells a story about Thomas, and he talks to the king, but he's martyred, right? And he even actually takes the materials that the king of Gundashapur gave him, and he uses it to serve the poor. So he's actually engaging with empire, but he's doing it on behalf of the margins, and he's martyred for it ultimately. And so, but after the time of Constantine, you have this new idea of that Christians can be in power, and it wasn't only in the Roman Empire that this idea really came to fruition, but you also had in Armenia and in Georgia, you had Christian empires that they themselves, sometimes committed acts of religious violence against minorities or against other people. Another example on the African continent is Ethiopia. Ethiopia became a Christian nation in the 300s, around this, just a little bit after the Roman Empire and Constantine. And there are actually examples of Ethiopian Christian empire oppressing and using Christianity to justify acts of genocide upon other surrounding neighbors in Africa, especially when you get into the Solomonic periods of the 13th and 14th century. So all that to say that while Western or European or Roman Christian context and in the dominant culture in the U.S., when we look at, manifest destiny, and we look at transatlantic slave trade, and we look at colonization around the world, European and Western Christians have used Christianity to justify acts of oppression at a broader and bigger scale more than other cultures. But at the same time, there have been other examples of how even other cultures on a micro level have tried to do so and have done similar things. And so it shows how there is a universal proclivity towards power and using religion in the service of economic and political and militaristic power, and that all of us can fall prey to that. And even in instances, various cultures, even outside of the West, have fallen prey to that. And so it really humbles us to remember that all of us as Christians, no matter what color, no matter what context, no matter what time period, have to resist that desire that we all humanly will feel to really grab a hold of imperial or political power. And again, remember that we follow the Prince of Peace and the man of sorrows, and the person who incarnates himself in the margins. And he calls us to also be really good, to be a witness to good news to the poor.
So if you'll allow me to skip around with you, a historian, a couple thousand years, coming back into the African-American church, in the last 400 years, as you say, that's developed in the Americas and the West. I wonder if you would separate out, because most people know that the majority of West African slaves actually went to Brazil and to the West Indies, and a small minority went to the Americas. Do you see the theological traditions splitting that way as well, North and South America, Afro-Brazilian theology versus African American theology?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't looked into, a lot of the, African communities in South America, especially, theological context, as much as I would like to. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there is a, like a lot more of, for example, even in Afro-Latino or Afro-Caribbean communities, in South America, there's, especially up until, the 20th century, there's a lot more Catholic, I think, presence there as well. You think of people like, again, one of the first Black American, in the sense of America's, one of the first, Black Christian saints was Saint Martin de Porres from Peru in the 16th century. And so, was also a patron saint even to this day of the poor and of social justice. And he himself underwent, racism, even in the Catholic Church in Lima and Peru. But even now today is one of the most venerated saints across South America. And so, I think that's maybe, one difference, whereas in the North America, you have the Black church is a much more heavily Protestant, if we want to use that word, but not so much of a Catholic, context. But one of the through lines, even if we compare, people like, St. Martin or others, is that there still is this kind of the common experience of Black people in the diaspora is that of oppression and marginalization. And so even if we want to triangulate it and go over to Europe, it's the same thing. When you look at, people like Olaudah Equiano or Otobo Cugoano, that, similarly, there are folks who are connecting with the Church of England. And so, because of the dominance of dominant culture, Christianity in North, South America or in Europe, that, Black Christians find themselves associating or being exposed to different strands of or different denominations of dominant culture Christianity. But the common experience is that of slavery and oppression and then later segregation. And so I would say there's a through line in Black theology across the diaspora, again, of one that, going back to our first question, one that's a holistic vision of the kingdom, whether it's Catholic or Protestant or Anglican or whatever. There's this holistic vision of the gospel. The gospel is both spiritual liberation and social liberation as well. So.
Right.
Well, I'm going down to New Orleans, honey, down behind the sun.
So that actually ties my next two questions together. If you could explore that just a little bit more, because you said the Black Church of the last 400 years has typically had better theology. And you talk a lot about the dualisms of white theology, or the dualisms that white theology tends to struggle with and put at a position of importance. So what is that dualism? What are the two things that whites are struggling with that maybe we shouldn't be, and that you don't see as prominent in the Black church?
Yeah. I think you said it best. Really kind of that dualistic, tendency that, again, I would say goes all the way back to the 4th century, where you have this dominant Roman church that is really promoting this idea of a Christian empire and a Christian nation and a Christian emperor and a Christian military that goes out into the world and serves the interests simultaneously of one particular empire that positions itself as being the light unto the world, and also the kingdom of God on earth that's going to impose itself upon other nations. That we have that same kind of theology even today. We see dominant culture, American religious nationalism, that, I would say is and there's so many examples in the 1700 years of various iterations of it. But I think along with that, you had, really the even beginning in the 4th century, you had kind of the, with the rise of an Imperial Christendom, you also have a departure from biblical ethics, right? Of the idea that Christians, and again, in the New Testament and for the first 3 centuries, Christians around the world were, and still are today, but for the first 3 centuries, it was the dominant perspective of Christians, that Christians are those people who exist and live and breathe in the margins, and that they are those people who divest their wealth and they divest their resources, and just like Jesus and the apostles talk about, in order to empower the poor and preach the gospel and hold to biblical orthodoxy. All those things, again, are holistic. And I think that in the 4th century, you start to see more of a departure from that kind of biblical ethic and more of a, we could say maybe kind of nominal or more more of a popularizing kind of Christianity. And that actually gave rise to a more extreme ascetic context where, again, you had the development of these two ways that the ascetic movement in Christianity really took off majorly in the 4th century in many ways as a response to this kind of emerging dominant perspective of Christianity that envision Christianity as the winners, or to use Luther's, again, jumping around millennia, to use Luther's terminology, right? That there is beginning more and more this theology of glory. And so it almost necessitated these Christians to dig deeper into this theology of the cross and saying, no, like the same way that we were being martyred in the first 3 centuries, that's the same kind of rigor and ethic that we need to continue to maintain. And it was almost being, now that Christians were in political power, at least in the Roman Empire, now we have to remember that was the opposite in the Persian Empire. And in fact, there was a causality that as Christianity became dominant in the Roman Empire, it actually resulted in the oppression of Christians in the Persian Empire, in modern day Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, that because Christianity was now being perceived as this Roman religion, that created a problem for non-Roman people. And especially in Persia, which was Rome's main enemy, that Persian Christians were being forced to choose between their Christian and Persian identity, which was not an issue before that time. But I think, I think that, but jumping back to the question, I think that that's really where, we started to see more of a Christian witness that wanted to hold on to the call of Christians to really be among the margins. But at the same time, there's this Imperial Christendom, or there's this other way that, again, has still been with us, that, again, divorces the truth aspects of Christianity, if we can say that, from the justice aspects of Christianity. And that's been going on for a long time. But I would say that in some way, the last thing I'll say about it is that in some ways we're living in an even more difficult time now, because since the 19th century, we've had kind of a more modern iteration of this binary, or this bifurcation. And that came in the form of this theological and academic divide between, again, truth and justice, that we've had these liberal conservative binaries that the Western dominant church in Europe first, with the rise of kind of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and Darwinism and Marxism, there's this whole emergence in 19th century Europe of theological liberalism, of people who are theologians and biblical scholars and Christians, but don't actually believe in the Bible and don't actually believe in, in the kind of the core Christian faith. And then, as that comes over into America, into the Americas, North and South, that same kind of binary starts to, on the more liberal side, starts to take on forms of social justice and, social gospel, liberation theology, whatever these, different concepts are called. But you have in the West, especially in academia, but it trickles into even denominational splits and organizational splits, that you have this liberal conservative schism that we're really still living in. And we're still seeing today that you have Christian denominations, academic institutions, and all other kind of nonprofits. And you have, and I'm just kind of generalizing, but it's a generalization that really proves true in a lot of spaces, that you have one side that emphasizes truth and the need to hold firm to orthodox theology and belief, and maybe even individual righteousness. And then you have another side that emphasizes social equity and justice and equality. And it's almost like the more one emphasizes their side, the more they move further away from the other side, and they just keep moving further away from each other. And we're still living and seeing that right now. But again, going back, in reality, we see that these things in the gospel are inseparable and undivided. But that's the space that we're really living in.
So you say in several places that that the Black church, there's been a large portion of the Black church that has kind of refused to let these split into truth versus righteousness, or truth versus justice, righteousness. And of course, in the Bible, as you point out in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, righteousness and justice are often paired together, so that really for biblical scholars, we consider them almost synonymous, that they're two sides of the same coin. That'll be confusing for a lot of people, though. I think a lot of people will think of, they've been raised in the American religion of Christianity, the majority religion that says something like the most important thing in this world is your personal relationship with Jesus Christ, right? And my personal piety and my personal sense of repentance and God's personal forgiveness of me. So why do you think it is, and I'm just asking you to wildly speculate, or maybe you have a great answer for this you've already researched, but why do you think it is that the African-American community was less able to give up what I would call the biblical view of righteousness and justice that are forged together and often in persecution. And maybe we can talk about how the white church has kind of made an industry out of this division between righteousness and justice.
Yeah. I think it goes back to, again, kind of tapping into my early church roots there. I mean, Tertullian said it best, that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the gospel.
Right.
And Tertullian was an early North African theologian. And he was living under persecution under Septimus Severus and other Roman emperors that were strongly persecuting Roman North African Christians. And I think it's not a surprise that it's from some of those North African Christians like Perpetuan Felicity and Peter of Alexandria and all these other North Africans that were the most rigorous about, again, not letting go of both the truth and the justice of the gospel, but also embracing the idea that following Jesus in this world, it will often mean that we don't have access to power. Now that's not a call to, kind of some kind of withdrawal or this kind of, we're going to, try to disassociate ourselves from the world, because they understood Jesus's prayer. They said, my prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but they were deeply engaged in society and politics, in government. But at the same time, we're standing true to the gospel, and thus, we're losing power and losing authority and losing influence, and we're being persecuted. And I think that, again, the Black church, the history of our people in the Western Hemisphere has been one of oppression. And so having context of oppression and having context of marginalization, it really helps to keep it helps to keep one really in the center of God's vision for his people. But it goes back to what Jesus was saying, that, man, how dangerous it is, or how difficult it is for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. It's like anybody who has power or has access to power and privilege is going to be tempted to use that privilege as a way of escaping, Jesus's call to pick up our cross and bear it. And I think that when you're dealing, whether it's, African Americans in this country dealing with slavery and Jim Crow, and now dealing with mass incarceration and gentrification and redlining and all these other kind of things that we've dealt with, or any marginalized people group around the world, that experience of marginalization is one that if one is beyond their own choices put in that kind of situation, and if they're a follower of Jesus, they are going to have, I would say, probably an exegetically a closer read and a better read of scripture than those of us, who are usually in situations of privilege. But even still, there's a way forward for those of us who find ourselves beyond our own choice as well, in situations of dominance and privilege and power, that there's a Zacchaeus road to enter into the kingdom. And there's a Barnabas road to divest wealth and to divest and put power and privilege at the feet of the church and the kingdom of God, to use it and leverage it, and then willfully enter into the marginalization that our global body of Christ shares around the world. But if we're and I think that, when you have people like, let's say, the Black church in America or any other marginalized people group who is forcibly put in situations of marginalization, and they're followers of Jesus, they're going to probably be the people that the global church should be looking to the most for leadership and for theological and ethical kind of lifestyles, and those are those are the very people we see in the New Testament, the unschooled, ordinary hood brothers like Peter and John. Those are the leaders, that the wealthy, the Barnabases and the other people actually get behind. And so,
I want to come back to that kind of how now shall we live, given everything that you said in a moment. But if I could summarize what you just said, I have a visual image in my head that it's pretty easy that if I'm on my video game system all day long, chilling out, doing whatever I want, having pizza delivered to my house, and I'm good to go, and I can walk around the street wearing whatever I want, nobody's going to stop me and ask me what I'm doing. Like, if that's the nature of my life, versus like my stepfather, it's difficult. He was raised African American in the South under Jim Crow laws. It's difficult to think about my personal relationship with God when you're bending over to drink from a water fountain marked colored, right? And that it's just difficult to just say, what I need to do. I need to straighten out my relationship with Jesus. That's all I need to do. because you're feeling these pressures constantly. And when you're in a community that feels these pressures and sees these pressures, I wonder, would you say that they actually see things in the text that the rest of us cannot, if we've not felt such pressures as a community?
Oh, definitely. I mean, again, going back to the history of this country and the development of these, kind of dominant. There's dominant Christendom even in the U.S., and then there's what Albert Rabbitoe calls slave religion. God rest in peace, brother. Just actually passed and transitioned. But Albert Rabbitoe's classic work, Slave Religion, also talks about again this development of to use Harriet Jacobs' terminology, the old Satan's church here below, but to God's heavenly church, I hope to go. And so, I think you definitely have that tradition that sees things in the text, that either, in the spirituals and in early Black preaching, the close connection that the Black church has always felt to the Hebrews in the Exodus narrative, that's something that was removed from the slave Bible, or was completely, so it was either not seen by the dominant church, or it was intentionally pulled out, passages in the text that clearly call for liberation of the poor and the oppressed, and for God's people to know what God's required of us, to do justice and walk humbly with the poor, and these things were pulled out or glossed over, and I think even still we have these arguments about whether it's CRT, or we have prominent evangelicals making these kind of statements about social justice has nothing to do with the gospel, that we still have people that, again, it's you can't read people's hearts, but it's got to be some mixture of either people are just blind to the clear call to God's people to act in justice on behalf of the marginalized, or an intentional kind of deceitful way of twisting the text and God's word to remove it from its ethical implications for God's people. But yeah, I think you're exactly right that when you are the one being forced to drink from the colored fountain, you're in a position where you're not able to ignore God's call for justice and liberation for all people.
Riding down the road to New Orleans with my sister.
With those prominent evangelical leaders, I'm sure you and I have some names in mind when you say that, but I've given up thinking that it's naivete or that they're just ignorant. I'm pretty convinced some of them, like, they know exactly what they're doing and they've got some other agenda. But that's just my own read after watching it for a couple decades. So I think, you say the Black church has felt a strong affinity for the Hebrew people. Part of that storyline, though, is that God, he tells Abraham, I'm going to let your children come into the land of Egypt and they're going to fall under slavery. And many Jewish interpreters, including one of our fellows for the Center for Hebraic Thought, he would say that actually God intentionally used the situation of Egyptian slavery, and it was a cruel, oppressive slavery. And of course, if you compared it to American slavery, it probably wouldn't actually would not look that bad as compared to the peculiar institution of American slavery. But it was cruel and oppressive. And Josh Berman would say, this was actually in order to bring them out. Not that he just liberated them from the hand of Egypt, but actually he liberated them as an equal group of people. Like, there were no noblemen, there were no high status, low status, that they all came out looking at each other. And Moses' own son was named Gershom. I was a foreigner there. Like, he identifies himself as a foreigner. And then you see the laws that are predicated on this is on how you're supposed to release. You can take servants, but you have to release them after so much time, and then the treatment of the foreigner. So this is a long way of saying, God seems to have done this intentionally with Israel to create a kind of nation who would breathe justice and extend that justice into the world. They did not. They very quickly went the other direction. But that seems to be the intention. There's a similar question you get with Holocaust. Did God do this to the Jews in order to make them the people they should become? Of course, there's a lot of Orthodox atheists that came out of the Holocaust as well. I wonder how your perception, and this is just your perception of it, how does the Black community struggle with that question? Did God lead us into the West African slave trade in order to make us into this kind of people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's I think a lot of parallels, and I think that'd be a great thing to for even a lot of theologians and religious leaders in the Black community to really have like a colloquium on. Honestly, it would be fascinating, because I don't know honestly how much I could even speak to what dominant perspective is, but I know from my perspective and from many other people historically and even today, I think it would be seen a little bit differently. And I think that while I would say that while we tend, for example, like we tend to, the Black church identifies theologically with Israel, but doesn't put ourselves in that situation, right? Like that we are Israel. And actually, I think there's been more of that in the dominant culture in America, right? That especially when we get into militarism, that, well, conquest narratives and see, well, God did this God called Israel to do this, therefore God's calling us to do this in our military. And I think in the Black church, there's a lot more of like there's like an allegorical connection, but we also know that like what God called Israel to do was unique kind of, there was a unique relationship that God had with Israel in the Old Testament that we as Christians, who are, grafted in and we're saved by grace, and that's a different kind of relationship. But there's, again, kind of an allegorical, connection and understanding. And so even with things like that, even if there would be a perception among, like, say, Black Old Testament scholars in agreement with that reading of Israel's narrative of Exodus, of God leading them in, my sense is that most people wouldn't read our experience in the same way. Certainly there's growing prominent Black religious communities that are not Christian that actually do read it exactly that way and literally connect the African American story as an extension of the Hebrew story. But among Black Christians, I would say that's, and at least my perspective is one that would not say, no, God did not intend actually for the transatlantic slave trade to happen, and that was an act of evil, and that God yet still worked through, and that God works all things for those who are called according to his purpose and who love him. And so, and one example of this is actually, and again, talking about even Hebrew slavery, talking about the differences and similarities of that. Probably one of the best examples of that during the slave time was the biography of Atobo Kuguano, who was a West African slave who was stolen and brought to the Caribbean, then ultimately went to England and gained his freedom. He became a Christian and was a theologian and exegete and part of the Sons of Africa, which was an abolitionist group. And he actually wrote in his biography was actually less of a story of his life, and it was actually an exegetical treatise on the issue of slavery. And in the early 1800s, in the throes of transatlantic slavery, when the reigning exegetical opinion throughout the dominant culture world was that slavery is okay, and that God, just like it was condoned in the Old Testament, it condones us to traffic slaves as well now. This Black man in England writes a scathing exegetical critique against the dominant perspective, and actually goes on to make an argument about why the slavery we see in the Old Testament was a vastly different thing than the slavery that he himself experienced, and condemned from the Bible, from biblical authority, actually condemned the traffic of slavery. But he has and I quoted in Gospel Hymen Note, he has a statement though where he's reflecting on his own experience and likens it to Joseph, and says that like Joseph, what my brothers intended for my harm, God actually worked out for my good. And so it's not that God intended this or called for this to happen, but God has been present with us in this and actually has used it. And so there's a gospel tradition, there's a musical tradition, there's a preaching tradition, there's a theology that we call gospel hymen, or a gospelist theology that has emerged from the Black church that God did not intend to happen the way it happened. And yet God worked in it because actually, again, this is going back to the bouncing back again, but the gospel was already making its way across the African continent, not only in North and in East Africa, but it was also making its way from African to African throughout Central and West and South Africa. But the marginalization of those early African Christian communities by the dominant culture in the Roman Empire, and then later the subsequent transatlantic slave trade, made it so that many Africans, but there were many who did still hear the gospel indigenously as it was intended to spread, I believe, through God's providence and through his mission to spread the gospel through the Hebrews who were in Alexandria, and the Hebrews that were in Nubia, and the Hebrews that were in Carthage. And then they spread the gospel to their non-Hebrew African neighbors, and it was intended to spread indigenously and freely. But European and dominant culture, Christianity and Christendom, or imperial theology, got in the way of that, or attempted to get in the way of that. But God in his providence still worked things out. And now we're even able to reconnect back to these stories and these trajectories of free spreading Christian history. And so, again, it's just a testament of how God will work all these things, even things he did not intend, but that human sin intervened and imposed its way, that God will still work His will even in the midst of that.
Yeah, and you see even slaves who are. I've been reading Lisa Bowen's book, African American Readings of Paul, and she shows how slaves who are almost exclusively preached to from Paul's, slaves obey your masters text, went on to read the rest of Paul and then read the Torah and then explain to their white masters why their theology was actually completely backwards. And I think what you're pointing out, or you seem to be flagging up, is, if you're in the dominant, let's just say dominant theological culture, you can make lazy readings of text, but if you're not, then you actually can't afford to lose and misunderstand the text, right? So there's more at stake for the people who aren't necessarily in the dominant culture if they're being oppressed in some way. I want to before we leave, I do want to talk about, you quote both D.L. Moody, Dwight Moody, the famous evangelist, who brings a loaf of bread and the gospel to a poor man. And you also quote Billy Graham, who in the South during the Jim Crow period did not feel that he had the right or didn't feel like he needed to address any of the Jim Crow laws that Black folks were suffering under at that time. I wonder, because I think a lot of people will have a lot of affection towards Billy Graham as this great evangelist, and Dwight Moody, a very famous evangelist during the Chicago fires and afterwards. But I wonder what's so dangerous about the message, both what Moody does with the loaf of bread and the gospel, and why isn't Billy Graham? I mean, why can't we just say, like, yeah, he's here to give the gospel. He's not here to solve discrimination. So what's so dangerous about those mentalities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I also grew up in a white evangelical Christian church that had a strong emphasis on spiritual salvation and evangelism. I went to evangelical schools where these figures were highly venerated. So I feel the same way. But I think one of the dangers of it is, again, going back into that binary. I mean, evangelicalism really comes out of one of the halves of the gospel that has really been in the dominant culture. Again, there's a lot of resources in the Black church and the gospelist tradition of the Black church that really is I think an antidote in many ways. But evangelicalism, or white evangelicalism, as it developed in these pivotal figures, Gordon and Moody and then later, Billy Graham, and it really comes out of like a bifurcated gospel, an incomplete gospel, just as incomplete as a liberal, progressive, mainline Christianity that calls for social reform and social justice, but is wishy-washy or is relative on matters of truth or biblical authority or Christology. That just as justice without truth is incomplete, also a true message, something that is theologically or otherworldly or afterlife context, is correct or orthodox, but is not liberative for the oppressed in this world, is also an incomplete gospel. So I think it goes to what's the danger of saying, well, someone's just here to preach the gospel and not enter into social issues, as Graham himself said. I think what's wrong with that, or the answer to explore what's wrong with that, is a further and more amplified definition of what the gospel is. And so if the gospel is, as Jesus himself said, good news to the poor, then how is it good news to the poor if I'm telling somebody, don't worry about the segregation and don't worry about the mass incarceration and the police brutality you are experiencing now, just believe in Jesus and it'll all be better later? That's not good news for the poor. That's not the full gospel. You're not giving the full gospel. And so that's an incomplete gospel. And so I think that's, I think that's really what is the problem with that.
So final question while I have you here. If you're in a majority world, and we're saying majority, I'm saying it strategically. I assume you are too, because we don't need to assume that white is the majority. We can go into lots of cultures and find all kinds of different majorities that would be non-white, non-European, and have similar problems. But if you are kind of in that majority world where you haven't thought through your theology, where you really have lived on the kind of pietistic, it's God's about my soul and salvation, and I don't know about all this other stuff. What do we do when in some ways I'm sitting here thinking, like, yeah, on the whole, the Black church because of their experiences and their refusal to give up into like a pietistic, soul-saving notion of Christianity, they know more, they see more than I do into the text. So now what? Do I just shut up, shut down? Do I go to a black church? Because I know people who've done that, and they're like, oh, well, and they stay there for a while, and they're like, oh, I was there, I made a too quick of a jump, and there were some other issues I wasn't ready for. So I think there's lots of very fast, simple moves that people might make, but what would you suggest that people do? Like, just practically speaking, like, I'm a Christian, I want to really put to practice what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's a great question as well. Yeah, I think, I think that, really, I think finding ways to really be taught and introduced. Again, I really love the way that in the, in the New Testament, that Jesus, Jesus himself incarnates, God incarnates in the hood, and that he uses, and he builds his church upon, apostles and leaders who are themselves from the hood. But at the same time, it's a multi-ethnic movement and multi-economic. It's not like, it's not like there's no place it's not like there's anybody of any demographic for whom there is no place,
right?
But there's room for everybody. And
to put some flesh on those bones, like, just tell people what you're talking about with Jesus and his movement. How were different people involved? I mean, we know the poor people of Nazareth and disciples, but what about where were the rich people in there that help out? Just to be clear.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, we see all these great examples in the New Testament of people who come from places of power and places of privilege, Zacchaeus and Gamaliel, right? And Barnabas and Lydia, like all these like wealthy, prominent, people who are welcomed into the beloved community, into the kingdom, into the church. And one of the things I think is interesting about those people is that there's always examples accompanying their story where they give up that wealth and they give up that power and they throw in their lot with people that in the world that they lived in, they would not have been expected to throw in their lot with, but they were actually living in a society that they were, not supposed to be fraternizing with. And so I think we mentioned, I think actually it could be a great idea to consider going to, biblically sound, theologically sound, Black or Hispanic or indigenous churches and really trying to fellowship with other folks and being led by, being mentored by leaders of color from BIPOC communities. Of course, like reading books and being able to, see the gospel for its holistic nature.
We should hold up your book here, Gospel Hymen Note, which is a collection of essays from lots of prominent scholars on the topic. So there's a great one to start with.
Yeah, that's right. And there's so many, more and more. I think just reading stuff like that and being and building relationships and again being mentored and going and fellowshipping in churches. And then also I think the last part is again kind of like a Gamaliel, is to keep one's presence to the degree that God is calling and it's healthy and sustaining and there's actually some opportunity there to keep one's place in positions of power and authority and speak prophetically to that on behalf of your brothers and sisters who are from marginalized communities, and to whether it's at the Thanksgiving dinner table or whether it's at a board table or whatever the case may be, to utilize those things. And so rather than intentionally just trying to walk away from or be done with these kinds of institutionalized or institutions of power, to actually maintain a presence in them and try to use that prophetically again and be a bridge between those resources and your brothers and sisters in marginalized contexts.
Yeah, I think that is so important to hear, because I think if you're trapped in the personal piety, soul salvation mentality, you think like, oh, okay, I have wealth and I have a position, I should just leave all of that because that's what's most important for my soul. And you're saying, no, think broader, get outside of your own salvation, get outside of your own piety, and think community, think global, as they say, right? Think global, act local. That's great. Dr. Vince Bantu, thank you so much for your leadership in this on this topic and for providing us so much wisdom and so much to think about here.
Oh, thank you.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.